The man's voice was terrifyingly calm. Not the calm of someone who had accepted defeat, not the calm of someone who had gone numb from fear. It was something kidia. It's older than that. Something forged over 22 years of doing the most dangerous and invisible work in federal law enforcement. It was the calm of a man who already knew exactly how this was going to end, who had run the numbers in his head before the cold steel of the handcuffs had finished clicking into place, and who understood with the clarity that only comes from absolute professional certainty that the person currently making the worst decision of their life was not him. "You're making a mistake," he said, his cheek against the wet asphalt rain soaking through the fabric of his dark hoodie, the grit of the road pressing into the side of his face. A career-ending mistake. The officer above him laughed. It was the kind of laugh that had never once questioned itself, broad and self-satisfied, the laugh of a man who had spent 12 years on this patch of Michigan earth, believing down to the marrow of his bones that he was untouchable. He shoved the suspect's head down against the cold metal of the patrol car roof as he loaded him into the back, a gesture so routine it required no conscious thought. He thought he had caught a thug. He thought he had caught a break-in artist, some opportunist lurking in a neighborhood where the lawns were always trimmed and the home values never dipped, where people like him didn't belong after dark. He thought he had done his job tonight, saved the neighborhood, maybe even earned himself a commendation. He was already composing the incident report in his head as he slammed the cruiser door. He didn't look at the badge on the passenger seat of the gray Tahoe. He didn't check the government plates. He didn't examine the federal credentials, tucked under a folded newspaper 2 feet from where his flashlight had been shining. He didn't do any of those things because he had already decided what he was dealing with before he ever got out of his cruiser. The decision had been made the moment he saw a black man sitting alone in a parked car on Whitmore Lane at 11 o'clock on a cold Tuesday night in November. After that, everything else was just paperwork. 11 minutes later, the police radio didn't chirp with a routine dispatch code. It screamed. The voice that came through the speaker was the chief of police himself, and it had the specific quality of a man who has just realized that the ground beneath his department is made of paper, not concrete, and that paper burns. The voice told Unit 3 Alpha to stop the vehicle immediately. The voice said the SAC of the Detroit FBI field office was on his personal line. The voice had a tremor in it that no one at Oak Ridge PD had ever heard before, because Chief Warren Gaines had spent 19 years being the most unshakable man in the room. And now he was not. This was not just an arrest. It was the moment the hunter realized he had just locked the wolf in his own car, handed him a microphone, and driven him toward the evidence that would bring down not just one corrupt officer, but an entire network of them. A network that had been operating in plain sight for 3 years, protected by money, by silence, and by the particular species of arrogance that only grows in men who have never once been held accountable for anything. Stay with us, because when 11 months of federal work collides with 11 minutes of ego, the wreckage is extraordinary. This is how it started. The rain had been falling on Oak Ridge, Michigan, since 5 o'clock that afternoon, and by 11, it had settled into the kind of steady, indifferent downpour that doesn't announce itself, doesn't build toward anything dramatic, just falls with the patience of something that has all the time in the world and knows it. Special Agent Marcus Webb sat in the driver's seat of a charcoal gray Chevy Tahoe with the engine off and the heat long gone, nursing the last 2 inches of lukewarm coffee from a stainless steel thermos that had seen better decades. He was 44 years old, 6'2", with the build of a man who had spent his 20s as a university linebacker and his 30s learning to carry that same physicality in a way that didn't announce itself, contained deliberate, the kind of presence that took up exactly the space it needed and no more. He was the assistant special agent in charge of the Detroit field office's organized crime division. Tonight, he was a man in a hoodie sitting in the dark, and that was the point. Whitmore Lane was one of those streets that existed in American suburbs like a kind of civic argument, a declaration that certain people had made it, that the distance between their lawns and the problems of the world was measured in square footage and HOA dues. The houses were colonial style, mostly red brick, set back from the road behind mature oak trees whose bare November branches made skeletal patterns against the orange wash of the streetlights. The neighborhood association would have described it as charming. Marcus would have described it as the kind of place where a man like him, sitting alone in a parked car after dark, was one neighbor's phone call away from a situation. He had known that going in. He had accepted it as one of the operational parameters of the job. House number 450 meters to his 11 o'clock belonged to Councilman Gerald Holt. Gerald Holt was 61 years old, a third-term city council member, chairman of the Municipal Infrastructure Committee. And if Marcus Webb's 11 months of case building were correct, and they were the linchpin of a money laundering operation that had moved approximately $12 million in criminal proceeds through a network of construction contracts, shell subcontractors, and fraudulently inflated municipal invoices. The RICO case that Marcus had been constructing since the previous December was a thing of genuine investigative craft. It had required 4 separate undercover contacts, 18 months of financial forensics, 2 grand jury subpoenas, and 1 very cooperative accountant from a Dearborn construction firm who had agreed to wear a wire in exchange for immunity and a new address in another state. The case had the kind of architectural completeness that federal prosecutors dreamed about: every wall load-bearing, every connection documented, every dollar traced from its dirty origin to its laundered destination. Marcus was not here tonight to arrest Gerald Holt. Holt's arrest would come in its own time, with its own theater choreographed and deliberate. Tonight was static surveillance, patient, unglamorous. The kind of work that didn't appear in recruitment brochures. Marcus was here to document who visited Holt the night before the city budget vote, specifically whether a particular labor union treasurer named Vincent Marsh showed up at the house as his phone records suggested he might. One photograph of Marsh's car in Holt's driveway would close the last open evidentiary thread in the financial conspiracy strand of the indictment. His backup team, 3 agents in 2 vehicles, was positioned at the northern and southern ends of the neighborhood perimeter 3 miles out, close enough to respond, far enough to avoid burning his cover. His radio stayed in the glove compartment. Deep cover protocol specifically designed to prevent the kind of accidental radio crosstalk that had burned more than one federal surveillance operation in Marcus's career. His communication was through his watch, a federal-issue device that monitored biometric data and GPS location with an automated distress beacon that triggered if his heart rate spiked above a defined threshold for more than 90 seconds, without a manual override, or if he failed to send a routine check-in signal within his designated 11-minute window. He was dressed for invisibility. Dark hoodie, black jeans, worn Timberland boots. No jacket with letters on it. No polo shirt with a bureau logo, nothing that said anything except that he was a man who had come from somewhere else and had no particular interest in being noticed. His service weapon, a Glock 19M, was in a concealed holster at his right hip. His federal credentials were on the passenger seat, tucked beneath a folded copy of the Detroit Free Press. His badge was clipped to the inside of the credential wallet, clearly visible to anyone who picked it up. He took a sip of cold coffee and watched Holt's front door. "Come on," Gerald Marcus said quietly to the rain-streaked windshield. "Make the call." He had been sitting there for 47 minutes. He had another 2 hours on his window before the next check-in with the field team. He was by every professional measure in complete control of this operation. Then the cruiser rolled past. He saw it in the rear-view mirror, Oak Ridge PD Unit 3 Alpha, moving slowly down Whitmore Lane with the particular cadence of a patrol that isn't going anywhere specific but is looking for something to be. Marcus kept his eyes on Holt's front door. Federal protocol. Don't look like you're watching the police. Don't act guilty, and you won't look guilty. The cruiser's brake lights flared red in the wet dark. Marcus felt the specific quality of stillness that experienced field agents develop. Not tensing, not reacting, just noting. The cruiser's reverse lights turned white. It began backing up. Marcus set the thermos down very carefully on the center console. "Don't do it," he said, his voice low and conversational, as if the officer in that cruiser could hear him through the glass and the rain. "Just keep driving. You have no idea what you're walking into." The cruiser backed up until it was parallel with the Tahoe's hood. Then the takedown lights activated a wall of blinding white illumination that flooded the Tahoe's interior and reduced everything outside to a gray wash of rain and shadow. Marcus Webb closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them, placed both hands on the steering wheel with his fingers spread wide, and waited for what was coming next. Officer Dale Pruitt had been told at various points in his career by various people with more authority and better judgment than him that he was a natural predator. His field training officer had said it as a compliment during his first year on the job, meaning that Pruitt had the instincts that he could feel trouble before it manifested, could read a scene the way a bloodhound reads a trail. Pruitt had carried that assessment with pride for 12 years, never once stopping to examine whether what his FTO had called instinct was actually something considerably less admirable. He was 38 years old. He had a thick neck, broad shoulders that strained the seams of his duty shirt, no matter what size he ordered, and a jaw that looked like it had been set at a permanent angle of mild contempt. His uniform was never quite right, the tie always slightly loose, the creases never quite sharp, the boots adequately maintained, but never immaculate. He was not the kind of man who thought presentation mattered, because in his experience, the gun and the badge did all the presenting that needed to be done. His colleagues at the Oak Ridge PD called him the landlord. It was meant affectionately, or at least it had started that way. Pruitt treated his patrol zone like property, like something he owned, something he was responsible for maintaining in a specific condition, something he had the right to defend against intrusions. Everyone on his beat eventually understood that there was a version of Oak Ridge that Pruitt approved of, and a version he did not, and that operating in the version he did not approve of had consequences. He had accumulated 7 excessive force complaints in 5 years. In any department with functional internal oversight, that number would have ended his career after the 3rd. But Oak Ridge PD's Internal Affairs Division was run by Sergeant Brody Sykes, a man who had known Dale Pruitt since they were both junior officers patrolling the South Side, and who had, over the course of 12 years, developed what could generously be described as a conflict of interest. The complaints against Pruitt were reviewed by Sykes, documented by Sykes, and filed by Sykes in the permanent record, with findings of insufficient evidence and conduct consistent with departmental policy. They disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of the department and were never heard from again. Pruitt knew this arrangement and relied on it the way a man relies on a load-bearing wall, without thinking about it consciously, but understanding at some baseline level that if it were ever removed, the whole structure would come down. What Marcus Webb had not yet been told, what the 11 months of building a RICO case against Gerald Holt had not yet fully surfaced, was that Dale Pruitt's presence on Whitmore Lane on Tuesday nights was not accidental. 3 years earlier, Pruitt had learned about Councilman Holt's construction contract scheme the same way most corruption in small Michigan cities gets discovered through a bar conversation with the wrong person. But rather than report what he knew to the FBI or the State Attorney General's office, Pruitt had done the math differently. He had driven to Gerald Holt's house on a Tuesday night, knocked on the door without calling ahead, and explained in the calm and conversational tone he used for his most serious business that he was aware of certain irregularities in the councilman's construction billing practices, and that he was prepared to make those irregularities disappear in exchange for $600 per week in cash and the occasional professional courtesy. Holt had agreed. He had not had much of a choice. The arrangement had expanded from there. Pruitt brought in Sergeant Sykes, who took 20% for continuing to manage the internal affairs paperwork. He brought in officers Ray Dobbins and Len Farrell, 2 men who had worked for him long enough to understand that loyalty to Dale Pruitt was considerably more profitable than loyalty to the department's code of conduct. The 4 of them formed an informal security apparatus around Holt's operation, running surveillance on his political rivals, running off anyone who loitered too long near his property, keeping the streets clean on Tuesday nights when Holt's associates came to visit. When Dale Pruitt's cruiser headlights swept the length of Whitmore Lane at 11 p.m. and landed on the gray Tahoe with the black man behind the wheel, his reaction was not in his mind racial. He would have told you that and believed it sincerely. What he felt he would have said was professional intuition. He would have said he had an eye for things that didn't fit, for elements of a scene that were out of place. He did not examine the irony that the things he invariably found out of place were black men in neighborhoods where he felt they didn't belong. He hit the reverse lights and backed up alongside the Tahoe, telling himself as he did it that this was just routine police work, that he was just doing his job, that if this turned out to be nothing, he'd let the guy go with an apology and be on his way. He believed this about himself. He was wrong about almost everything else, and he was wrong about this too. The passenger side window of the Tahoe was already rolled down by the time Pruitt reached it. Marcus had lowered it before the cruiser even finished parking, because 22 years in federal law enforcement had taught him that the speed with which you make yourself non-threatening in these situations is measured in increments that matter enormously, and that every second of preparation is a second less of improvisation. Pruitt's flashlight came through the window at full force, aimed directly at Marcus's face, not at his hands, not at the interior of the vehicle. At his face, which meant that Pruitt was not gathering information. He was establishing dominance. "License and registration," Pruitt said. "Now." No greeting, no reason given, no pretense at courtesy. Just the command delivered in the flat, authoritative bark of a man who had given this particular instruction so many times, it had become automatic, stripped of every social fiber it might once have contained. "Good evening, Officer," Marcus said. His voice was deep and steady, the voice he used in briefing rooms and federal courtrooms and hostile interrogations, the voice that did not carry a single thread of the fear or anger that were both present and both being managed. "I'm a federal agent. My credentials are on the passenger seat right there under the newspaper. I also have a service weapon in a holster on my right hip. I'm going to keep both hands on the wheel and let you retrieve the credentials yourself, or I can reach for them slowly if you prefer. Either way is fine." Pruitt's flashlight didn't move. He leaned forward and let his forearms rest on the bottom of the window frame, a posture that was both physically intrusive and deliberate. It brought his face level with Marcus's, close enough that Marcus could smell the stale coffee and the faint chemical sweetness of wintergreen tobacco. "I said license and registration," Pruitt said. "Not a speech." "I understand that. My federal credentials will cover both. They're right there, plainly visible, approximately 18 inches from your flashlight. I'll decide what I need to look at." Pruitt shifted the flashlight to the passenger seat for approximately 1 second, then back to Marcus's face. 1 second. He had seen the newspaper and the shape of something under it and had chosen not to investigate further. "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus had run this calculation before the cruiser's reverse lights ever appeared. He was a professional. He had faced hostile actors in environments considerably more dangerous than the passenger seat of a government Tahoe on a quiet Michigan street. The tactical reality was simple. If he resisted the order, Pruitt would escalate. An escalation in this configuration, a lone federal agent on a dark road, no radio backup 3 miles out, had a range of outcomes that included his being shot by a corrupt local cop who would spend the next 48 hours constructing a justification. If he complied, he blew his cover, lost potentially irreplaceable surveillance on the Holt operation, and endured whatever indignity Pruitt had in mind. Chant. The math was ugly, but it was clear. He complied. He survived and won. He resisted and potentially did neither. "I want to be very clear that I am complying voluntarily," Marcus said, his hands moving slowly to the door handle. "And that what is happening here constitutes an unlawful stop without probable cause, which I will be documenting in detail." "Out," Pruitt said. Marcus opened the door and stepped into the rain. He stood 3 inches taller than Pruitt, and for a fraction of a second, just a fraction, the physical reality of that shifted something in the air between them. Pruitt's jaw tightened. He didn't like it. He stepped forward, closing the distance, reasserting by proximity the dominance that Marcus's height had momentarily threatened. "Turn around, hands on the hood, spread them." "My name is Special Agent Marcus Webb," Marcus said, using Pruitt's name tag, which he had read in the first 2 seconds of the stop. "Officer Pruitt, the credentials I mentioned are on that seat. If you would simply take 15 seconds to—" "Shut up!" Pruitt's hand hit Marcus's shoulder and shoved him forward into the side of the Tahoe. The vehicle's wet metal absorbed the impact, and Marcus exhaled sharply as the air was pushed from his lungs. He pressed his hands flat against the hood, spreading his fingers, making himself as legible as possible to every camera that might be watching, to every future prosecutor who might someday need to understand exactly what had happened here. Don't move. Don't talk. Pruitt's hands moved over him, quick, aggressive, thorough, in the places where aggression read as thoroughness, and sloppiness in the place where it didn't matter. Marcus felt the moment Pruitt's fingers found the concealed holster at his hip, felt the pause that lasted exactly long enough to be significant, and then he heard what he had been waiting for. Gun Pruitt's voice changed register entirely, going from controlled authority to something genuinely panicked. The panic of a man who has decided he was right about something dangerous and is now terrified to be right. Gun! He's got a gun! Nolan, get over here! It is a federally issued service weapon. Marcus said, his voice rising for the first time, not from anger, but from the need to be heard and recorded clearly. I am FBI. Do not escalate this situation. I am telling you, I am a federal law enforcement officer, and my credentials, but the logic had already left the building exactly as Marcus had been afraid it might. Pruitt kicked Marcus's legs apart from behind, forcing him to his knees in the wet grass at the edge of the road. The rookie officer, Cal Merritt, 19 months out of the academy, with a thin face and the particular pallor of someone who had realized in the last 30 seconds that something had gone very wrong, rushed forward from the rear of the cruiser where he had been stationed. Cuff him! Cuff him now! Pruitt was roaring. Pruitt, Merritt started. Cuff him, Merritt! Now! Marcus felt the cold bite of the steel around his left wrist, then his right, the ratchet pulling tight with the specific finality of a mechanism that has completed its function. He was on his knees in the mud, hands locked behind his back, the rain falling on the back of his neck, the wet grass soaking through the knees of his jeans. He looked at the ground in front of him. He looked at the mud. He looked at the small stones pressing into his kneecaps. Then he began working. Not physically. His body was exactly where Pruitt wanted it, but his mind shifted into a different mode, methodical, precise recording. The time, 11:14 p.m. The location approximately 80 meters north of 420 Whitmore Lane. The officer Dale Pruitt, badge number readable from the nameplate. The procedural violations: stop, without probable cause, failure to examine, presented credentials. Failure to announce charges before cuffing, use of force on a non-resisting subject. The specific words Pruitt had used, he cataloged them in sequence, not because he had to work to remember them. He had a memory trained by 2 decades of witness interviews and court testimony, but because the act of cataloging them was the most effective thing he could do with the next few minutes. Pruitt yanked him upright by the handcuffs. The pain was specific and identifiable. A searing pull through both shoulders, the joint structure of his arms torqued at an angle they were not designed for. The cuffs biting into the skin above his wrist bones with the targeted cruelty of an implement that had been designed without any consideration for what it felt like to be wearing it. Marcus did not make a sound. He absorbed the pain, filed it one more line in the incident report being assembled in his head, and allowed himself to be walked toward the cruiser. As Pruitt steered him along the side of the vehicle toward the rear door, Marcus glanced back past the cruiser's hood, past the swing of Pruitt's flashlight, toward the colonial house 50 meters up the road. The curtains at the front window of 420 Whitmore Lane had moved. In the gap between the fabric and the window frame, just visible in the warm interior light of Councilman Gerald Holt's living room, was the silhouette of a man watching. Holt had seen the whole thing. He knew what Pruitt was doing and why. He had paid for it. 11 months. Marcus let the weight of that land once allowed himself to feel for exactly the duration of 2 steps, the specific bitterness of watching months of careful, painstaking, brilliant investigative work dissolve in real time because a corrupt local cop had looked at him and seen a criminal, and then he set it down. He set it down with the practiced efficiency of a man who has learned that feelings, however legitimate, are not things that serve you when you're being loaded into the back of a cruiser by someone who would love nothing more than for you to give him a reason to escalate further. He got into the car. Inside the cruiser. In the front seat, Officer Cal Merritt sat rigid in the passenger seat, with his hands flat on his thighs, staring straight ahead through the rain-blurred windshield, with the expression of a man trying very hard to convince himself that he was not part of what he was obviously part of. He was 26 years old, He had joined the department because his father had been a cop, and his grandfather before that, because the uniform had seemed like an honorable thing to wear, because he had believed when he raised his right hand at his swearing-in ceremony that the words he was saying were not just procedural formalities but genuine commitments. He had understood in the last 4 minutes that he was working for a man who had no relationship with those commitments whatsoever. Pruitt climbed into the driver's seat, his adrenaline still running hot. He was drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, a rapid, unconscious percussion that Marcus recognized as the physical expression of a high that was starting to shift towards something more anxious. Pruitt reached for the radio and called in a 1015 suspect in custody, resisting arrest possession of concealed weapon, Unit 3, Alpha southbound, toward the precinct. His voice on the radio was controlled and professional, the voice he kept for official purposes, entirely unlike the voice he had been using on the side of the road. Flynn Merritt started. Pruitt corrected automatically, not looking at him. Pruitt Merritt, said his own voice, low and careful, like a man feeling his way across a floor he's not sure will hold his weight. Maybe we should have checked his ID. He really didn't act like a... Don't be soft about it, Pruitt said, glancing in the rearview mirror at Marcus. The headlights of oncoming traffic intermittently lit the interior of the cruiser, and in those flashes, Pruitt's expression was readable, the defensive bluster of a man who has done something he knows in some part of himself was wrong, and who is building the architecture of justification in real time. Everybody's a lawyer or a federal agent when they get caught. Guy was sitting outside a councilman's house in a hoodie in a neighborhood like that, at 11 o'clock. You tell me what that looks like. It looks like a person sitting in a car, Merritt said quietly. Pruitt ignored him. Marcus leaned forward as far as the cuffs and the cage divider allowed. Officer Merritt, he said. His voice was calm, conversational. The voice he used when he was trying to reach someone. Merritt startled slightly, then composed himself. Yeah, check the computer. Run the plate of the Tahoe. It's a fleet vehicle registered to the U.S. General Services Administration. Then run my name, Marcus Webb, through the NCIC database. Do both of those things, and then you'll know exactly what kind of situation you're in. Pruitt's hand came down hard on the top of the cage. Don't run anything, he said. We book him as a John Doe if he won't produce ID voluntarily. Let the desk sergeant sort it out. You left my credentials in the vehicle, Marcus said, addressing Pruitt directly now. Which is a procedural violation. You also left the Tahoe unlocked on a public street with a federally registered service weapon inside. That's a separate federal infraction. I want you to understand that I'm documenting both of those facts right now. You shut your mouth, Pruitt said, and the warmth had dropped entirely out of his voice, now replaced by something colder and more deliberate. He angled the rearview mirror until he could see Marcus's face. You're in my world now, pal. You speak when I tell you to speak. Marcus let a beat pass. Then, you have 11 minutes. Pruitt's eyes stayed on the road. What? 11 minutes, Marcus said. That's the check-in window. My field team tracks this vehicle's GPS. They're monitoring my biometrics through my watch. My heart rate has been elevated for the last 7 minutes. I should have sent a manual override 4 minutes ago. I didn't because my hands are currently behind my back. He paused, letting that land. When the distress beacon triggers, it goes to 3 agents who are currently parked 3 miles from where you pulled me over. They will notify the field office, who will notify the SAC, who will notify your chief. Another pause. I'm estimating 11 minutes from right now. That's how long you have to pull over, remove these cuffs, and make a decision about how the rest of your career goes. Pruitt's fingers went still on the steering wheel. The drumming stopped. He let out a short, sharp exhalation that was trying very hard to be a laugh. You watch too many movies. But in the passenger seat, Cal Merritt's hands were already moving toward the onboard laptop. What are you doing? Pruitt's voice had a new edge in it. Running the plate, Merritt said. His fingers moved over the keyboard. He didn't look at Pruitt. He was past the point where looking at Pruitt would help him. I told you not to, I heard you. Merritt's voice was very quiet. Not defiant. Just finished with something. I'm doing it anyway. The rain hammered the roof of the cruiser. The windshield wipers moved in their mechanical arc back and forth, the rhythm of them, the only sound for the 30 seconds it took the NCIC query to process. Marcus in the back seat had closed his eyes. Not from fear, from focus. He was counting down from 11 minutes in his head, tracking the seconds with the internal metronome of a man who had spent years doing timed operations in environments where a watch would have blown his cover. The laptop chimed. Merritt stared at the screen. Then he turned it slowly so Pruitt could see it from the driver's seat. "Garrett, pull over." "I'm not pulling over." "Pruitt!" Merritt's voice cracked at the edges. He turned the laptop further, angling it toward the driver. "Look at the screen." The database return was not a standard criminal history query result. It was not a wants and warrants check or a vehicle registration document. The top third of the screen was occupied by a solid red banner, the kind that the NCIC reserved for a very small number of entries, the kind that indicated a classification level that the standard query interface was not designed to handle. The banner read in text large enough to be read from the driver's seat. "Federal Law Enforcement Officer, do not detain, contact SAC, Detroit Field Office, immediately classified, operation in progress." Below the banner, a photograph. Marcus Webb in a suit looking directly into the camera, with the calm of a man who has nothing to prove to anyone, his credentials and title displayed beneath it. Marcus T. Webb, Assistant Special Agent in Charge, Organized Crime Division, Detroit Field Office, Security Clearance, TS/SCI. Pruitt looked at the screen. The color left his face the way color leaves a face when the cardiovascular system redirects blood to more essential locations, gradually, then all at once, until what remained was the gray-white of a man confronting something his body had registered as a survival threat before his brain had caught up. "It's a hack," he said. His voice was working to stay even. "Someone can spoof these things. There are people who—" "You cannot hack the NCIC from the back of a police cruiser," Garrett Merritt said, and his voice had stopped shaking. Something had clarified for him in the last 30 seconds. Some interior calculation had completed itself, and what had come out the other side was a version of Cal Merritt that was done being complicit in Dale Pruitt's decisions. "That's not how any of this works. We just arrested the head of the FBI's Organized Crime Division." The silence in the car was absolute for 3 seconds. Then Pruitt did what Pruitt always did when he didn't have an exit. He accelerated. "We bring him in," he said, his voice going rigid. "We process him. We find something." He had a gun. He was threatening us. "We stick to what happened." "Dale, we run this town," Pruitt said, and his voice had taken on the particular quality of a man repeating a thing he has always believed because the act of saying it aloud is the only thing keeping him from understanding that it is no longer true. "Not the feds, not some suit from Detroit with a fancy badge. We run this town." From the backseat, Marcus Webb's voice came through the cage divider with a quietness that somehow carried more authority than anything else that had been said in the last 10 minutes. 8 minutes. Pruitt's hands tightened on the wheel. "I told you," Merritt said softly. He turned back to the laptop, and with hands that were no longer steady but had not stopped moving, he began to compose an entry in the incident report. He was already thinking about how to describe what he had witnessed in language that was accurate and complete, because Cal Merritt had made in the last 2 minutes the most consequential professional decision of his life, and he had made it in the direction of his conscience rather than his self-interest. Marcus closed his eyes again. 7 minutes. 6. Wow! The radio crackled. It wasn't dispatch. The voice that came through the radio on the cruiser's dashboard was not the familiar half-board cadence of the Oak Ridge PD overnight dispatcher. It was a voice that Marcus Webb recognized even through the speaker distortion and the rain noise, and that voice belonged to Chief of Police Warren Gaines, who was 60 years old and had spent 19 of them being the most composed man in any room. He entered, and who currently sounded like a man who had been handed a grenade and was trying to figure out how far he could throw it before it went off. Unit 3 Alpha. Gaines's voice was tight in the way that expensive guitar strings are tight, the kind of tension that is 1/4 turn away from snapping. "This is Chief Gaines. What is your current location? Over." Pruitt grabbed the radio mic from the dashboard mount, his hand closing around it too fast, too hard. "Chief, we're southbound on Whitmore bringing in a 1015. resisting arrest possession of a concealed. Unit 3 Alpha. Gaines's voice rode over Pruitt's, the way a wave rides over a stone, completely without acknowledgement. I have the special agent in charge of the Detroit FBI field office on my personal cell phone. He tells me you have one of his agents in your vehicle. He tells me his agent's distress beacon has just triggered. You will stop your vehicle. Immediately. You will not proceed to the precinct. You will stop where you are, and you will not touch that individual again. Do you copy? Pruitt stared at the radio mic in his hand. In the amber light of the dashboard, his face had completed its transition from gray-white to the specific defeated pallor of a man who has run out of angles. He lowered the mic. It slipped from his fingers and swung from the dashboard cord like a pendulum back and forth in the drafts from the cruiser's heating system. From the back seat, very quietly, 11. Marcus Webb leaned back against the hard plastic of the rear seat and let himself for the first time since the takedown lights had flooded the interior of his Tahoe experience something adjacent to satisfaction. It was not triumph. Triumph was for people who were surprised by outcomes, and Marcus had not been surprised by this outcome. He had known from the moment he heard Pruitt's voice on the side of the road how this particular story ended. The middle had been unpleasant. The ending was not in doubt. The lights came from two directions at once. To the north, 3 unmarked black SUVs materialized out of the rain dark, as if they had assembled themselves from the weather. Their headlights not flickering on from off, but simply being on their presence, establishing itself on Whitmore Lane, with the absolute finality of something that had been there all along, and had simply chosen to be visible now. They moved across the intersection ahead of the cruiser at a speed that was controlled and exact, forming a diagonal barrier across both lanes that left no room for interpretation. To the east above this tree line, the sound of a rotor. The helicopter dropped below the canopy of bare oak branches, its searchlight descending like a finger from a cloud, and the finger touched the cruiser. And stayed there, a column of white light so intense that the rain itself was visible inside it. Every drop a brief and brilliant point of light in the instant before it hit the ground. Pruitt slammed the brakes. The cruiser skidded on the wet asphalt, the rear end stepping sideways before the wheels found purchase, and the vehicle shuddered to a stop at an angle in the road. For a moment, maybe 3 seconds, nothing moved except the rain and the helicopter's light and the swing of the disconnected radio mic on the dashboard. Then the SUV doors opened. The agents who emerged did not move the way television law enforcement moves. They did not crouch dramatically or shout at full volume or wave their weapons in arcs designed to communicate readiness. They moved the way people move when they have been trained to a level of competence where movement itself becomes efficient rather than expressive. They spread across the road in a formation that covered every angle of the cruiser's exterior. Their carbines held at the low ready, their body armor marked with the 3 letters that Pruitt had just told his fellow officer they did not answer to. FBI, Special Agent in Charge. Diane Knox emerged from the lead vehicle last. She was 51 with gray-streaked hair pulled back with the functionality of a woman who had stopped making decorative choices about her appearance approximately 20 years ago and had not missed them. She wore a dark suit under a tactical vest that looked like it had been borrowed from someone larger and had been worn so many times it fit her perfectly now. She had run the Detroit field office's operations division for 6 years, and before that she had spent 8 years doing the kind of work in the Southeast that was still classified in ways that most of her colleagues didn't have clearance to read about. She stood in the rain and looked at the cruiser with the expression of someone surveying damage they had been briefed on and expected and were now confirming. A voice came from the lead SUV's external speaker. Not a shout, not an amplified command, but a clear and level instruction delivered at a volume that carried through the rain without effort. Driver of the police vehicle, throw the ignition keys out the driver's window. Exit the vehicle, walking backwards, with your hands visible on your head, chow. Passenger officer, do the same through the passenger door. Do it now. Pruitt's hands were on the wheel. He was staring through the windshield at the wall of federal steel and federal agents and the federal helicopter that was keeping its light on him, with the patience of something that had been doing this long before he existed and would continue doing it long after he was gone. He looked in the rearview mirror for the last time. Marcus Webb was looking back at him. Marcus was not smiling. He was not performing satisfaction or vindication or anything that could be interpreted as gloating. His expression was, if anything, one of professional exhaustion, the look of a man who has done something difficult and necessary, and is already thinking about what comes next. "Open the door, Officer Pruitt," Marcus said. "Don't make them breach the vehicle. You won't enjoy the breach." Pruitt's hand moved to the window control. He pressed it. The window slid down and the rain came in. He reached to the ignition, removed the keys, and threw them through the opening. They hit the wet asphalt outside with a small metallic clatter that was absurdly quiet given the circumstances. He opened the door and stepped out into the light. The agents who reached Pruitt were not rough with him in the way he had been rough with Marcus. They were something more unsettling than rough. They were precise. They took his keys from his belt with the efficiency of people who had done this thousands of times. They removed his service weapon from its holster, his backup piece from his ankle holster, and the taser from his left hip with movements so practiced they seemed choreographed. They turned him to face his own vehicle and placed him against it in a posture that was with exact deliberateness a mirror of what he had done to Marcus 20 minutes earlier. Hands on the hood, feet spread, weight forward. In the passenger seats of the cruiser, Officer Cal Merritt had his hands already visible on the dashboard before anyone gave him an instruction. He stepped out when directed, hands on his head, and stood against the rear of the vehicle with the air of a man who has accepted a consequence he helped create. Two agents opened the rear door of the cruiser, not the way Pruitt had opened it with the casual authority of ownership, the door shoved wide with a wrist flick but carefully, as if they were aware that the person inside was not a problem to be managed, but a colleague who had been put somewhere he should not have been put. One agent crouched at the door opening. The other had the handcuff key already in his hand. "Agent Webb," the first agent said. "We've got you." Marcus turned on the seat and offered his wrists. The key went in. The cuffs came away. He pulled his hands forward and held them in front of him for a moment. Looking at the red lines, the steel had pressed into the skin above his wrist bones, the color of the marks, the way they tracked the exact path of the cuff's edge. He noted them with the same methodical attention he had given everything else about the last 20 minutes. Evidence. Documentation. The physical record of what Dale Pruitt had chosen to do. He breathed once. The kind of breath that is not about oxygen management, but about something else, about the transition between one mode of being and another, between the person who had been kneeling in the mud with his hands locked behind his back and the person who was about to get out of this vehicle. It took one breath. He gave himself that one breath and no more. He stepped out of the cruiser. He eyed. The second agent had a dry jacket, bureau-issue dark blue, and draped it over Marcus's shoulders without ceremony or theatrics. The way you hand something useful to someone who needs it. Marcus pulled it around himself and stood in the rain for a moment, looking at the scene around him. The formation of vehicles, the agents at their positions, the helicopter still holding its light on the tableau, the two local officers detained against their cruiser. Then he walked toward Pruitt. The circle of agents standing around the cruiser's hood shifted as he approached, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention to itself, just the small natural adjustments of people making space for someone who has earned the right to move through them. Marcus stopped 2 feet from Pruitt and looked at him. Pruitt was looking at the hood of his own car. His jaw was working. His hands were flex-cuffed behind him, and he was standing in the rain in his own uniform. And there was nothing left of the man who had been drumming his fingers on the steering wheel 20 minutes ago, with the high-energy confidence of someone who believed the whole world ran on his schedule. Marcus looked at him for a moment. He looked at the mud on his own knees, still drying in the cold air. He looked at the red lines on his wrists, fading now, but not gone. "Officer Pruitt," Marcus said. His voice was quiet. Not gentle. There was nothing gentle about it, but quiet in the way that means what's being said doesn't need volume to land. "I want you to understand something, not as a reprimand, as a fact that I think you may not have fully processed yet." Pruitt raised his eyes. He didn't speak. "You were sitting behind me," Marcus said. "I had my hands on the wheel and my identification on the passenger seat in plain view. And I told you what it was, and you had your flashlight, and you looked at it for approximately 1 second. 1 second. And then you put the flashlight back on my face." He paused. 4 more seconds. That's all it would have taken. Pick up the credential wallet open. It read the first 2 lines. 4 seconds. And you would have driven away, and we would never have spoken again, and your career would have continued in whatever direction it was already going. Pruitt swallowed. It was visible in his throat. But you didn't do that, Marcus said, because you had already decided what I was before you got out of your cruiser. You decided based on what I looked like and where I was sitting, and then you made everything that came after fit that decision. You didn't gather evidence. You enforced a story you'd already written. He let that sit for a moment. That's not police work. That's not even close to police work. And I want you to know, not because I want you to feel bad about it, but because I want you to understand the full scope of what just happened, that every word you said in that vehicle was recorded. The racial slur, the "we run this town," the $600. He watched Pruitt's face absorb that last number and saw the exact moment it landed. You're not under arrest for being a corrupt officer. You're under arrest for being a stupid one. There is a difference. The first I sometimes cannot prove. The second is on tape. He turned to Agent Knox, who had walked over and was standing to his left with the quiet authority of someone who has been waiting for the conversation to finish because she respects the person having it. Barrett Pruitt said, startling both of them. For a moment, then Knox understood that Pruitt was speaking to someone else, that he was staring at another agent, muttering something about knowing someone about the union, about get him in a vehicle, Knox said. Not loudly, just finally. 2 agents lifted Pruitt by the arms and walked him toward the nearest SUV. His feet moved. His mouth was still working, producing sounds that weren't quite words anymore. The verbal detritus of a man whose internal operating system had catastrophically crashed and was rebooting with access to much less data than it had started with. Knox looked at Marcus. "You're all right. I'm operational," Marcus said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her for a moment. Diane Knox was one of approximately 4 people in the Bureau who could have asked that question and received an honest answer. "I'm all right," he said. "The operation isn't. We know." She turned to look at Holt's house down the road. The curtains were closed now. "We're moving on that next." The Oak Ridge Police Department's main precinct was a 2-story building in the downtown block, red brick and institutional glass, built in 1987 and updated in ways that were mainly cosmetic. The lobby had new flooring. The dispatch center had new monitors. The break room had a coffee machine that had been purchased 3 years ago with asset forfeiture funds. The underlying structure of the institution, its culture, its internal architecture of loyalty and protection and managed consequence was exactly what it had always been. By the time Marcus Webb walked through the front door at 20 past midnight, that underlying structure was being dismantled piece by piece. The lobby was a controlled chaos. FBI agents moved through the space with the focused efficiency of people executing a plan that had been prepared well in advance, which Knox had been building. The Oak Ridge search warrant application for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment to execute it, and Marcus's arrest had provided both the legal predicate and the operational pressure to move immediately rather than wait. Agents were at every workstation, some working keyboards, some working filing cabinets, some coordinating with the forensics team that had arrived in a white van and was currently setting up in the parking lot. Every door camera and body cam log was being downloaded to encrypted federal drives. Every arrest record from the last 4 years was being boxed and cataloged. The cruiser's dash cam footage, both the external camera and the interior feed, had already been secured and was in chain of custody packaging. Chief Warren Gaines stood in the center of the bullpen in his white uniform shirt with his collar open and a complexion that had moved from its usual ruddy authority to something closer to the color of old newspaper. He was not a corrupt man. Marcus had reviewed his financial history as part of the preliminary investigation and found nothing that indicated Gaines was directly involved in Pruitt's arrangement with Holt. But he was a man who had looked the other way long enough to have become complicit by inertia, and the distinction between those two things was going to depend very much on what the next 72 hours revealed. "This is unprecedented," Gaines said to no one in particular and to whoever would listen. "You cannot walk into a police department and commandeer the facility without, I want to see a warrant." I want to see the specific authorization." The double doors to the bullpen swung open. Marcus Webb walked in. He was still wearing the dark hoodie and the muddy jeans and the boots that had knelt in wet grass less than an hour ago. His badge was clipped to his belt, now visible, and the contrast between what he was wearing and what the badge represented was not lost on anyone in the room. He walked through the space with the stride of someone who is not performing authority, but simply has it the particular walk of a man who knows exactly where he's going and why and what will happen when he gets there. He walked directly to Chief Gaines and stopped close enough that Gaines would have had to step back to create more space, and Gaines, to his credit, didn't step back. Marcus reached into the back pocket of his jeans and produced a folded document. He didn't unfold it. He pressed it against Gaines's chest, flat-palmed, and held it there until Gaines's hand came up automatically to take it. "Federal seizure order," Marcus said. "Authorized 40 minutes ago by the Honorable Patricia Brennan, United States District Court. It covers all digital storage, all body camera logs, all dash camera footage, all arrest and incident records from January of last year through tonight. Your department is a federal crime scene, Chief Gaines. My agents have authorization to be in every space in this building except your personal bathroom. And honestly, if the paperwork holds what I think it holds, I'm going to want to take a look in there too." Gaines stared at him, then at the document, then back at him. "Dale Pruitt is one officer. Whatever he did, he's not one officer." Marcus turned and walked toward the personnel records room, and Knox fell in beside him. Two tactical agents followed as a matter of course. "Bring me the file on Brody Sykes." Sykes's file arrived in 2 minutes, pulled by an agent who had been in the records room since before Marcus walked in the front door. Marcus opened it on an empty desk in the patrol sergeant's office and began reading with the methodical attention of someone who already knows most of what the document contains but needs to see it in its official form. The financial cross the shared bank branch, the deposits every third Friday, the jointly registered recreational vehicle was even cleaner in the official record than it had appeared in the forensic summary. The pattern was not subtle. It had survived not because it was hidden well, but because no one with the authority to look at it had ever genuinely wanted to look at it. "Bring me Sykes," Marcus said. Sykes arrived at the precinct in a bathrobe and slippers. 40 minutes later, having been collected from his home in Dearborn Heights by two agents who had knocked on his door with the warrant and the courtesy of professionals who understood the difference between what someone deserves and how you treat them while you're arresting them. He was 52, heavy through the middle, with the air of a man who had spent enough years running his particular corner of institutional protection that he had genuinely stopped imagining it could end. He tried the union protection angle in the lobby. Knox informed him without apparent emotion that union representation rights do not extend to federal racketeering charges, and that he was welcome to retain private counsel, which he would need to do quickly. Marcus stood at the window of the patrol sergeant's office, looking out at the parking lot where the forensics van's lights were still working, and said to Knox, who was standing behind him, "Pruitt was too comfortable. That kind of comfort doesn't grow alone." Someone watered it. Knox was already on her phone coordinating the warrants for Dobbins and Farrell. The interrogation room at Oak Ridge PD was a standard configuration painted concrete walls fluorescent panel. Overhead a steel table with a ring bolt anchored to the surface. Two chairs with non-matching legs that created a subtle physical disadvantage for the person who ended up in the shorter one. Pruitt had used this room many times. He knew which chair to take. He had not been given the choice. He was in the shorter chair, hands cuffed to the table ring still in his uniform, because no one had offered him a change of clothing. Marcus came in alone. He was carrying a paper cup of coffee, two actually, one in each hand, and he set one on the table in front of Pruitt without any preamble or ceremony. The way you'd set a cup of coffee in front of someone you've been sitting across from for an hour and are just now getting back to. He sat down in the taller chair, opened the file folder he'd brought, and began reading without speaking. Pruitt stared at the coffee cup. He did not touch it. "Garrett Allen Pruitt," Marcus read aloud as if reviewing a document for accuracy, rather than performing its contents. 12-year veteran. 3 commendations for controlled substance interdiction. 7 excessive force complaints, all filed between the first year and the present, all reviewed and closed by Sergeant Brody Sykes. None escalated. None independently reviewed. He turned a page. Married 14 years to Sandra Voss Pruitt. No children. One residence, a 3-bedroom on Carrington Drive, purchased 6 years ago. Current assessed value, $430,000. He looked up. Officer Pruitt, you own a boat. Pruitt said nothing. A Sea Ray 280 Sundancer, Marcus continued. Purchased approximately 3 years ago for $92,000. Paid in full. Cash purchase structured through a marine broker in Toledo. He set the page down and picked up his coffee. On a base salary of $67,000 a year, with a mortgage on a $430,000 home, you paid $92,000 cash for a boat. We checked your family financial history. Your parents, both deceased, died with essentially no estate. There is no inheritance. He took a sip. But there is a very interesting relationship between your bank account and the payroll subsidiary of Holt Municipal Contractors, LLC, which is a shell entity controlled by Councilman Gerald Holt. Pruitt shifted in his chair. The cuffs clinked against the table ring. The deposits began 3 years and 2 months ago, Marcus said. $600 every Tuesday, without exception, except for the 3 weeks you were on vacation in 2022, when they dropped to $300 and then went back to $600 when you returned. Regular as a salary, which is technically what it was. Marcus closed the folder and folded his hands on top of it. Tell me about the consulting. Pruitt looked at the wall to Marcus's left. I did some consulting work for one of the contractor's administrative people. Zoning compliance advice. It was legal. It was not legal, Marcus said. But more importantly, for our purposes right now, it was not consulting. He opened the folder again and removed a single page, a printout of a financial timeline. He laid it flat in front of Pruitt and turned it so that it was readable from Pruitt's side of the table. You see the dates in the left column. Those are the dates of your deposits. You see the dates in the right column. Those are the dates on which named political opponents of Councilman Holt received parking citations, noise complaints, or were stopped and detained by an Oak Ridge PD officer on your beat. He tapped the page. 11 for 11, Officer Pruitt. Every single time Holt needed someone inconvenienced, a deposit appeared in your account within 48 hours. That's not consulting. That's a billing statement. The silence in the room stretched out. The fluorescent panel buzzed faintly overhead. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. Pruitt tried. He tried the smart lie, the version of the story that had worked in smaller rooms with smaller stakes, that the dates were coincidental, that the deposits were for legitimate advice, that the stops were independent police decisions based on his professional judgment. He built the argument with the limited structural materials available to him, and Marcus let him finish it. And then Marcus dismantled it with the timeline document and 2 additional exhibits, a text message recovered from Holt's phone records and a bank statement from Brody Sykes's personal account that showed a corresponding 20% cut appearing within 1 business day of every Pruitt deposit. Pruitt sat with the collapsed version of his story for approximately 40 seconds. Then he broke. It was not the cinematic breakdown of someone who has been saving tears for a dramatic moment. It was quieter than that, and more complete, the deflation of a man who has been holding a large amount of pressurized air and has finally allowed it to go. His shoulders dropped, his hands went still. He stared at the table. He named Sykes, he named Dobbins and Farrell. He named the overtime sergeant who had signed off on the falsified hours, and he named, though his voice had to work harder for this one, the councilman's connection to a state-level political fundraiser through whom 3 additional corrupt payments had flowed. Marcus watched him without interruption, without expression. When Pruitt was done, Marcus closed the folder, stood, and lifted his coffee cup from the table. He looked at the man across from him, the exhausted, diminished remnant of the person who had slammed his chest against a Tahoe on Whitmore Lane less than 2 hours ago, and said very quietly, $600 a week. You torched your entire life for $600 a week. He didn't wait for a response. He knocked twice on the door and stepped into the hallway. The warrants for Officers Ray Dobbins and Len Farrell were executed simultaneously at 4:47 a.m. before either man's shift would have started, specifically to prevent them from receiving word from anyone at the precinct and making a decision about their morning that would complicate the arrests. Dobbins opened his front door to find Knox and 2 agents on his porch. Farrell was collected from his attached garage, where he had apparently been awake already drinking coffee beside his truck, and he simply set the cup down when he saw the agents come through the side gate and stood with his hands already at his sides, not raised, not reaching for anything. The posture of someone who has been expecting a knock for long enough that the knock itself is almost a relief. Sergeant Brody Sykes spent 3 hours in a conference room with a federal public defender before emerging with a partial cooperation agreement that gave the prosecution his documented records of complaint suppression in exchange for a reduction in his own charges from racketeering conspiracy to obstruction. The agreement required him to provide copies of everything, every complaint, every closing memo, every communication with Pruitt about the disposition of use of force reports. The resulting stack of documents was almost 2 inches thick. Gerald Holt's front door opened at 6:15 a.m. to Marcus Webb and Diane Knox on his porch in the gray early morning light, a federal indictment folder between them. Holt was still in his robe. He was 61 years old, and he looked in that moment considerably older. A man whose face had spent the night working through the available options and had arrived somewhere around 3 in the morning at the understanding that there were or none. He did not run. He did not demand to speak to a lawyer before he saw the folder. He just looked at it for a moment, then stepped back from the door and said, "You'd better come in." Holt's attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement within 48 hours. The terms required Holt to provide complete testimony against his financial network, the state-level political connections, the shell contractor structure, the 3 additional municipal officials who had received payments from the laundered construction proceeds. In exchange, his primary charge was reduced from RICO conspiracy to a single count of money laundering with a sentencing recommendation of 7 years and potential reduction for substantial assistance. He also confirmed under oath and in the presence of 2 federal prosecutors what the financial records had suggested but not definitively proven, that 3 years and 2 months ago, Dale Pruitt had knocked on his front door on a Tuesday night without calling ahead and had explained in the calm and conversational tone that Holt would later describe to a grand jury as the voice of a man who has done this before, that he was aware of certain irregularities and was prepared to make them disappear in exchange for $600 per week. Holt had not approached Pruitt. Pruitt had come to him. Pruitt had set the price. Pruitt had identified the other officers and organized their participation. Pruitt, in other words, was not a pawn in someone else's scheme. He was the architect of it, the man who had seen an opportunity in someone else's corruption and had built his own operation around it, like a parasite that has grown large enough to believe it created its host. Cal Merritt's cooperation was given without negotiation. He sat across from a federal prosecutor for 6 hours and described in chronological and procedural detail everything he had witnessed: the body camera disabling the stops on Whitmore Lane, the conversations in the cruiser between himself and Pruitt about what Pruitt called keeping the street clean, and the 2 occasions on which Pruitt had, in Merritt's presence, handed a sealed envelope to an individual outside the driver's window of the cruiser and driven away without writing an incident report. He was granted immunity. He spent the next 3 months on administrative leave, and then he resigned from the Oak Ridge PD voluntarily. And then he applied to a social work certification program at a community college in Ann Arbor, which accepted him. The dashcam footage from Pruitt's cruiser existed in 2 forms. The first was the external feed, the camera mounted on the windshield pointed forward, capturing everything that happened on the road in front of the vehicle, from the moment Pruitt activated his lights to the moment the FBI SUVs established the roadblock and the cruiser skidded to a halt. The second was the interior feed, the camera positioned behind the rearview mirror, pointed backward into the passenger compartment, which captured everything that happened inside the vehicle, including both Pruitt's face and through the cage divider Marcus's. Both feeds were downloaded by FBI forensics within 30 minutes of the cruiser being secured. Both were placed in chain of custody packaging and logged as evidence. Both were included as required by federal disclosure rules in the discovery materials forwarded to Pruitt's public defender following the formal charges. Local journalist Tessa Hale had been covering the Oak Ridge City Council for 7 years. She was 34, methodical, and had developed the patience through the sustained disappointment of watching story after story disappear into the machinery of institutional non-accountability of someone who had learned to wait. She filed a public records request for all dash cam footage related to the federal arrest incident within 36 hours of Pruitt's charges being made public. A federal judge granted partial release of the exterior footage and a 2-minute excerpt of the interior footage, specifically the portion that included the NCIC database return and Pruitt's verbal response 48 hours after that. Hale posted the 7-minute compilation at 6:04 a.m. on a Thursday morning in December. She titled it Oak Ridge Cop vs. FBI Agent, the $600 Mistake. She wrote 3 sentences of context and let the footage speak. By 8 a.m., the video had been viewed 60,000 times. By noon, it had crossed 4 million. By the following morning, with the clip reposted across every major platform, shared by news organizations on 4 continents, and excerpted in segments broadcast on network morning programs, the original upload had been viewed 31 million times, making it the most watched news clip in the country for 11 consecutive days. The moment that everyone clipped, shared, memed, and analyzed was the one that Marcus had anticipated: the NCIC screen turning red, the large bold text of the federal agent designation visible in the camera feed and then captured in the interior feed with absolute clarity, the complete and instantaneous evacuation of Dale Pruitt's self-assurance. The swagger that had been in his posture since the moment he first lit up the Tahoe simply vanished, replaced by the specific physical language of a man who has just understood what he has done and cannot undo it. The contrast between the Pruitt of 5 minutes earlier, the looming, certain self-appointed king of Whitmore Lane, and the Pruitt of that moment was so total, so comprehensive, that it communicated something beyond the specifics of the story. It communicated something universal about the relationship between unchecked power and the moment it meets its limit. The wire audio was worse for Pruitt's future prospects than the video, if such a thing were possible. The casual racial slur, quiet, reflexive, muttered in the darkness of the cruiser, as if it were simply part of the vocabulary of his internal monologue, was reproduced in full in every responsible news outlet's reporting, and in a significant number of less responsible ones as well. It was not a word that had been deployed in anger or in extremity. It was a word that had simply been there, the way furniture is simply there, which told people more about its speaker than any deliberate insult could have. And then there was the line. 5 words said with the flat certainty of a man who believed them completely. "We run this town, not the feds." The internet did what the internet does with a line like that. It became a hashtag, a meme format, a call and response, a shorthand for a category of hubris so well known to so many people that the words didn't need explanation. The clip of Pruitt saying those words while Marcus Webb's federal credentials blinked on a screen 3 feet in front of him was viewed more than 8 million times as a standalone excerpt. Dale Pruitt was sitting at his kitchen table on the Thursday morning when the video went live, trying to eat a bowl of cereal he had poured 20 minutes earlier and had not yet tasted. He was out on bond, a substantial sum, secured against the house, and his attorney had advised him to stay home, stay offline, stay quiet, and let the legal process work at its own pace. His phone buzzed once at 7:15 a.m., then again at 7:17. Then, continuously, a vibration that didn't stop the notification pattern, changing from individual alerts to the kind of rapid-fire accumulation that indicates something has scaled past the point where individual tracking makes sense. He picked it up. He opened the first notification. He put the phone face down on the table and sat with his hands flat on either side of the cereal bowl for a long time. Then he walked to the window and looked through the blinds. 4 news vans were parked on his street. The CNN satellite dish was already raised. A reporter in a navy coat was standing on the property line with a microphone speaking to a camera with the practiced gravity of someone delivering important information. More vans were turning the corner. Sandra Pruitt came downstairs at 7:45 a.m., dressed in a charcoal blazer and holding a canvas bag that was clearly packed for more than a day trip. She set it by the front door without ceremony and walked past the kitchen to the coffee maker. "Where are you going?" Pruitt's voice had lost the quality it relied on, the base authority, the certainty, and what remained was something smaller and less structured. "My sister Sandra said." She poured coffee into a travel mug she had taken from the cabinet above the machine, a mug she had not used in years. She screwed the lid on. She turned to look at him, and the look she gave him was one he had never received from her before and had not expected and could not immediately categorize. It was not anger. Anger would have been easier. It was something quieter and more complete, the expression of someone who has finished grieving something and has arrived after a long journey at the dry ground on the other side of it. "I saw the video," she said. Pruitt started to say something. She shook her head, not with hostility, just with the finality of someone closing a book. "I lost my position this morning," she said. "The district called at 7. They said I was a reputational liability. I can't go to the grocery store without—" She stopped, reorganized. "I'm going to my sister's, Dale. Don't call me before you talk to your lawyer." She picked up the canvas bag. She walked past him to the door. She did not look back. The door closed. An hour later, the sound of a diesel engine brought Pruitt back to the window. A flatbed truck was backing into his driveway, and the man in coveralls who climbed out of the cab was moving toward the trailer connection point of the C-Ray, with the specific purposefulness of someone who has done this before and does not expect to have a pleasant conversation about it. Pruitt went outside. The reporters surged toward his property line, microphones extended. He didn't look at them. He walked directly to the man in coveralls. "That's my boat." The man in coveralls handed him a clipboard without looking up. Bank called the note. "Breach of contract on the loan terms. Plus there's an IRS freeze order on assets associated with the account." He indicated a line on the clipboard. "Sign acknowledging you received notice. I paid cash for that boat." The man in coveralls looked at him for the first time. His expression was not unkind, simply neutral. The expression of someone who has received this exact argument before and who understands that it is not actually an argument. The freeze order covers all assets acquired within the specified period, regardless of payment method, sir. I'm just doing the retrieval. The reporters on the property line were shouting questions. Cameras were pointed at him. His name was trending on every platform he had never paid attention to and would never recover from. The cereal was still on the kitchen table uneaten. His wife was driving to her sister's. His boat was being winched onto the flatbed. He stood in the driveway in the cold morning air in sweatpants and a department-issue thermal shirt and watched everything disappear. He did not go back inside for a long time. 6 months after the night on Whitmore Lane, the Federal District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan opened its proceedings in the matter of United States of America versus Garrett Allen Pruitt, with the particular atmosphere that federal courtrooms develop when a case has been in the national consciousness long enough that the verdict feels like a foregone conclusion, and the trial itself feels like the formal narration of something that already happened. The courtroom smelled of mahogany oil and floor wax, and the specific kind of institutional anxiety that settles into furniture over decades of high-stakes proceedings. The gallery was at capacity every day. Media organizations had applied for pool coverage weeks in advance. The seal of the United States presided over everything from its position above the judge's bench, polished to an exactness that communicated without commentary the weight of what happened in this room. Pruitt sat at the defense table in a suit that had been purchased from a department store with the $400 remaining in a checking account that the federal seizure had not reached. It was navy blue, and it was 2 sizes too large for the man he had become in the 6 months since his arrest. He had lost 22 pounds, the particular weight loss of someone under sustained stress who has also lost access to the appetite that once sustained him. His court-appointed defense attorney was a man named Morris Langley, 50, with the bearing of a public defender who has spent 2 decades doing exceptional work in conditions that were rarely exceptional, and who had reviewed the federal discovery file in this case and had immediately understood that his job here was not to win, but to ensure that his client received every procedural protection to which he was entitled, and that the sentence when it came was applied within appropriate guidelines rather than in excess of them. Langley was a good lawyer, doing an impossible job, and he knew it, and he did it anyway, which said something about him. The prosecutor was Assistant U.S. Attorney Camille Okafor, 42, who had been at the Eastern District for 14 years and had built her reputation on the same principle she applied to every case. Quiet architecture, then detonation. She did not perform in court. She built things carefully and without flourish. And then she stepped back and let them stand on their own structural integrity. It was multiple judges had noted in their written opinions on her trial conduct among the most effective approaches to federal prosecution they had encountered. The prosecution's opening statement took 37 minutes. Okafor used 26 of them to lay the financial and operational architecture of what she described as a protection racket masquerading as law enforcement. The deposits, the timeline correlations, the Sykes arrangement, the Dobbins and Farrell participation, the Holt connection. She used the remaining 11 minutes to play a single excerpt of audio from Marcus Webb's wire, The Moment in the Cruiser, where Pruitt's voice said flatly and completely and without a shadow of ambiguity, "We run this town, not the feds." The jury heard it and did not move. The physical evidence was comprehensive. The financial forensics, conducted by a team from the FBI's white-collar crime unit and independently verified by a forensic accounting firm retained by the prosecution, traced every dollar of the 3-year arrangement with the specificity that Pruitt's structured cash deposits had been specifically designed to prevent. The body camera records showed a pattern of disabling that coincided with statistical certainty that the government's expert described as not consistent with equipment malfunction with every stop Pruitt made on Whitmore Lane. The dashcam footage was entered as Exhibit A and viewed by the jury in full, without pause or editing, from the moment Pruitt first hit his reverse lights to the moment the FBI SUVs blocked the road. Councilman Holt testified in a county-issue blazer that did not fit his shoulders, speaking with the flat affect of a man delivering information he had agreed to deliver and was delivering without embellishment and without particular remorse as part of a transaction he had calculated was in his interests. He confirmed the timeline. He confirmed the amounts. He confirmed the structure of the arrangement and the names of everyone involved in it. He did not look at Pruitt while he testified. Merritt testified for 3 hours. He was calm in the way that people are calm when they have made peace with something that cost them and are reporting on it accurately rather than performing it for an audience. He described the night of the arrest, the stop, the credential refusal, the escalation, the moment the NCIC screen returned the federal agent designation, and Pruitt's response to it. He described the 2 occasions he had witnessed envelope transfers. He described the body camera procedure, the specific sequence of events by which Pruitt disabled the recording, and the language Pruitt used when he directed Merritt to do the same. He cried once briefly when Okafor asked him whether he believed at the time he complied with Pruitt's direction to disable his camera that he was doing the right thing. He said no. He walked to the witness stand on the 3rd day of the trial, and the way he walked the same measured, purposeful stride that had carried him across a wet road toward Dale Pruitt's takedown lights that had taken him through the door of the Oak Ridge PD's lobby at midnight in a muddy hoodie with his badge on his belt, created a quality of attention in the room that courtrooms only develop when the person walking has, without doing anything deliberate or theatrical, communicated something about the weight of what they are carrying and their preparedness to carry it. He was sworn in. He stated his name, rank, and assignment for the record. He settled in the chair with the posture of a man who is comfortable being looked at. Okafor's direct examination was structured to mirror the narrative arc of the case itself, establishing first who Marcus was and what he had been doing on Whitmore Lane, then the stop, then the events inside the cruiser, then the federal response. She asked each question with the economy of a prosecutor who trusts her witness to fill the space without being prodded, and Marcus answered with the economy of a man who has given deposition testimony in federal court enough times to understand that precision is more powerful than volume. He described the surveillance assignment. He described the operational parameters, the backup team, the communication protocol, the check-in window. He described the moment the cruiser's reverse lights appeared in his rearview mirror and his decision in the seconds before Pruitt reached his window about how to conduct himself in the stop that was coming. "You chose to comply with Officer Pruitt's orders," Okafor said, despite being a senior federal officer with every legal authority to refuse an unlawful stop. "Why?" "Because my compliance kept me alive," Marcus said. "And because I understood that the most effective way to document what Officer Pruitt was doing was to allow him to do it in its full scope, while I recorded everything that happened, rather than to invoke my authority in a way that would have cut the interaction short." He paused. I want to be clear that I am not describing some kind of tactical sacrifice. I'm describing a professional calculation made in real time. I assessed that Pruitt's behavior in the first 60 seconds of the stop was consistent with a pattern of conduct that was either actively illegal or substantially adjacent to it, and I decided that the most useful thing I could do was make sure that pattern was fully documented before I ended the interaction. On cross-examination, Morris Langley tried the only angle he had, which was not a strong angle, but was the only one available, the split-second decision framework, the operational pressure of an 11 p.m. patrol stop in a high-value neighborhood, the genuine uncertainty that any officer might have felt when confronting an uncooperative individual in an unfamiliar vehicle. Marcus let him build the question. He waited for it to finish. Then he said, "Counselor, the split-second decision framework is a meaningful legal and operational consideration in situations where a decision must actually be made in a split second. It applies to active threat environments, to dynamic physical confrontations where the actor has no time to gather additional information before acting. It does not apply to a situation where a man is seated quietly behind a steering wheel with his hands on it, speaking to you calmly, pointing at a credential wallet on the passenger seat and asking you to look at it." He looked at Langley steadily. Officer Pruitt had minutes. He had the credential wallet within reach of his flashlight. He looked at it for 1 second. He made a choice. That choice was not split second. It was deliberate. Langley started to respond. Marcus continued. "I have worked federal law enforcement for 22 years, he said. I have been in every kind of difficult situation this job produces. I have been in actual split-second situations where lives genuinely depended on decisions made in the span of a heartbeat. I understand what that is. What happened on Whitmore Lane was not that. What happened was that an officer looked at a black man in a car in a wealthy neighborhood and decided before he ever got out of his cruiser what that man was. Everything that followed was a consequence of that decision. He looked at the jury then not because he was performing for them, but because what he was about to say was meant for everyone in the room. I have been doing this work for more than 2 decades. I have been cuffed in this country exactly once. I would like the jury to think carefully about what was different on the night in question." Langley had no follow-up question. He sat down. Okafor did not re-examine. She simply said, "Nothing further, Your Honor," and sat down, and the silence that followed Marcus Webb's testimony was the kind of silence that has gravity to it, the kind that people feel in their chests rather than simply hearing with their ears. 2 hours and 23 minutes. That was how long the jury deliberated. In federal criminal cases involving 17 counts across multiple conspiracy and civil rights statutes, supported by financial forensics, wire recordings, body camera logs, and testimony from 3 cooperating witnesses, including a sitting city council member, 2 hours and 23 minutes was not a quick verdict. It was the minimum amount of time required to work through the count list with appropriate care and reach the same conclusion on every item. The foreperson, a retired high school principal from Dearborn Heights, named Evelyn James, who had listened to 9 days of testimony with the attentiveness of someone who understood that other people's fate was in her hands and intended to honor that understanding, stood and read the verdict. Guilty. On every count. All 17. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Conspiracy to commit racketeering. Assault on a federal officer. Obstruction of a federal investigation. Kidnapping of a federal officer. 6 counts related to the protection racket structure. 4 counts related to the financial irregularities. 2 counts related to the suppression of internal affairs documentation. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Count after count after count, each one landing in the room with the small weight of a stone that individually is manageable, but accumulated becomes a wall. Pruitt's hands were on the table edge. He didn't collapse. Whatever physical resources remained to him after 6 months of waiting for this moment were being expended on remaining upright, but his grip on the table's edge told its own story. His knuckles were white. His shoulders had dropped by degrees over the course of the reading, each guilty finding, removing another small piece of the structure that was keeping him in an approximation of composure. Judge Rosalind Marsh was 62 years old, a former Detroit public defender who had been elevated to the federal bench 15 years earlier and who had since developed a reputation for conducting proceedings with a precision and fairness that left no procedural surface unexamined, and for sentencing with a clarity of purpose that made her written opinions among the most frequently cited in the circuit. She did not rush. She looked at Pruitt for a long moment before she spoke, and the look was not contemptuous. Contempt would have been too personal for Rosalind Marsh's courtroom, but it was not without weight. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "the evidence in this case established to the satisfaction of this jury, beyond any reasonable doubt, that you spent 3 years operating a criminal enterprise within the structure of a law enforcement institution. You used the authority granted to you by the people of this state to extort a public official to target and harass innocent civilians in service of that official's agenda, to suppress the legitimate professional complaints of your colleagues, and to recruit other officers into conduct that violated every oath you collectively took. You then, when confronted by the consequence of your own decisions, committed a federal crime against a law enforcement officer who had done nothing to you except exist in a place that your prejudice told you he did not belong." She paused and looked down at her sentencing documents, then back up. "You told that officer while he was handcuffed in the back of your vehicle that you run this town. The United States of America would like the record to formally reflect its disagreement." The gallery erupted. The gavel came down. On the consolidated federal charges, Judge Marsh continued over the subsiding noise, including the deprivation of civil rights under color of law, the racketeering conspiracy, and the assault and kidnapping of a federal officer. This court sentences you to 32 years in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The court recommends placement at USP Hazleton, a high-security facility based on the nature of the offenses, the position of trust abused, and the defendant's documented history of targeting vulnerable individuals. You will not be eligible for parole consideration for 20 years. Pruitt's attorney placed a hand on his arm. Pruitt was looking at the table. His jaw was moving, but no sound was coming out. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck the sound block with a finality that seemed in the silence that followed it to exceed the simple physics of wood on wood. It was the sound of a door closing, not a dramatic door, just a door. Marcus was eating a slice of cherry pie at a diner 3 blocks from the courthouse when his phone rang from an unknown number. He looked at it for a moment, the specific evaluative look of someone who has received calls from unknown numbers that turned out to matter and has learned not to dismiss them, and answered. The voice on the other end was processed through a basic digital distortion filter, the kind that changes timbre and pitch without eliminating the underlying cadence and grammar of the speaker. It was not a voice he recognized, but it had the particular precision of someone who was choosing their words carefully and had prepared what they wanted to say. "You got Pruitt," the voice said. "Good for you. But you didn't get the money." Marcus set down his fork. "Who is this?" Pruitt had a partner, not a cop, not Holt, someone who managed the financial architecture, someone who made the deposits invisible and the offshore accounts untraceable. A pause. "There's $4.2 million that your seizure warrant didn't reach, and you're never going to find it." The line went dead. Marcus sat with the phone in his hand for 10 seconds. The pie was in front of him. The diner was warm and smelled of coffee and short-order cooking. The television above the counter was showing the courthouse footage on a loop, his own face walking down the steps, speaking into microphones. He pulled up the financial forensics report on his secure tablet, which he had with him, because Marcus Webb always had his case materials with him, and had never once in 22 years operated on the assumption that a case was fully closed before he had personally verified the closing. He had read the report 3 times during the trial. He read it again, now more slowly, with the specific attention of someone looking for something they hadn't been looking for before. The offshore accounts were documented. 3 accounts in the Cayman Islands traced through a chain of beneficial ownership structures that the Bureau's forensic accountants had spent 6 weeks unwinding. The accounts had been identified, flagged, and included in the federal seizure warrant. The warrant had been executed the morning after Pruitt's arrest. But the execution notes showed something that had not during the trial seemed significant. The accounts had been accessed and drained in the 6-hour window between the time of Pruitt's arrest and the time the banking freeze was formally applied. 6 hours. The balance at the time of the freeze was 0. The records showed a single consolidated transfer executed in 3 tranches over 40 minutes, moving the full balance to an intermediary account whose beneficial owner was listed under a business name registered in Delaware. Marcus stared at the tablet. He opened the personal profile section of Pruitt's file. Under spouse, Sandra Voss Pruitt. Occupation, Senior Branch Manager. First Meridian Bank. 17 years of service in the Compliance and International Wire Transfer Division. Among her professional credentials, Certification in Bank Secrecy Act, Compliance Certification in Anti-Money Laundering Detection, a continuing education record that demonstrated in every year of the last decade advanced coursework in exactly the legal frameworks that governed the kind of offshore transfer structure the forensic accountants had spent 6 weeks unwinding. Sandra Pruitt had not just known about the money. She had built the structure that moved it, protected it, and when the moment came, moved it again. The going to her sister's exit on the morning the video went viral had not been the panicked departure of a wife abandoning a sinking ship. It had been the first move in a carefully sequenced extraction plan. The canvas bag she had packed contained Marcus now understood considerably more than a change of clothes. And the tears, the pity, the quiet, dignified exit past the kitchen table, all of it had been, if not necessarily performed, at least managed. Managed by someone who understood that the appearance of being a victim was the best available cover for someone who was not. He closed the tablet. He left 2 20s on the table for the pie he hadn't finished. He picked up his phone and called the Port Authority. The private airfield on the eastern edge of Metro Detroit was not the kind of facility that appeared in tourism brochures or flight school promotional materials. It was a functional strip, 2 runways, a small terminal, several hangars used primarily by corporate charters, private owners, and the occasional medical transport. At 10:47 p.m., on the night of Pruitt's sentencing, a Gulfstream G450, registered to a charter company based in Fort Lauderdale, was in Hangar 4 with its engines in the early stages of their pre-departure sequence, its navigation lights cycling through their startup check and its cabin door in the open and lowered position, waiting for its single passenger to finish boarding. Marcus's headlights hit the hangar doors at 10:51. He drove the sedan directly onto the apron, bypassing the security gate on the authority of the national security hold he had called into the Port Authority 4 minutes earlier and brought it to a stop with the nose of the vehicle 8 feet from the jet's forward landing gear. He stepped out with his badge already raised and the specific energy of someone who has done this before and knows exactly what the next 4 minutes look like. The pilot visible through the cockpit window cut the engines. The high descending whine of the turbines winding down filled the apron. The navigation lights kept cycling. The automated systems didn't know yet that the flight wasn't happening. Sandra Pruitt appeared at the top of the cabin stairs. She was wearing a linen blazer over a silk blouse, dark trousers, with a precise crease shoes that had been chosen for a flight rather than a scene. She was carrying a leather tote bag over one shoulder. Her hair was done with the care of someone who intends to be seen and intends to look composed when they are. She took in Marcus Webb standing at the bottom of the stairs with his badge raised, and her face did something complex and brief. Not panic, not surprise, something more controlled than either, before settling into an expression that was almost impressive in its smoothness. "Agent Webb," she said, as if they were meeting at a conference. "This seems a little dramatic." "Come down the stairs," Sandra Marcus said. She descended them at her own pace, not hurrying, not performing reluctance, just moving. She stopped 2 steps from the bottom, which put her slightly above eye level with him. The detail was not accidental. "I'm taking a vacation," she said. "My husband has just been sentenced to 32 years in federal prison. I think most people would agree I've earned a vacation." Sandra Voss, Marcus said, her maiden name. Her eyes sharpened slightly at it. Senior Branch Manager, First Meridian Bank, 17 years in the Wire Compliance and Anti-Money Laundering Division. Certification in Bank Secrecy Act Procedure. Advanced coursework in offshore account structure and beneficial ownership identification. He held her gaze. "You didn't marry a dirty cop. You were his CFO." Something moved behind her eyes. Not guilt exactly. Something more like the professional recognition of a person who has been outmaneuvered by someone she underestimated. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said. "I had no knowledge of Dale's criminal activity. I'm the victim in this Agent Webb." My reputation has been destroyed. My career is gone. My husband is... We traced the IP address of the offshore transfer, Marcus said. The one that emptied the 3 Cayman accounts 6 hours after your husband's arrest. The transfer was executed from a tablet registered to your iCloud account on the First Meridian Bank wire transfer platform using your institutional access credentials. He watched her. You moved $4.2 million while the sentencing hearing was still in deliberation. You thought that everyone in the federal system would be looking at the courthouse and not at the accounts. Sandra descended the final 2 steps. She was on the apron now, and the distance between them was the distance of a conversation. Behind her, from the direction of the terminal, the sound of sirens was approaching the local police, the new interim leadership of the Oak Ridge PD coordinating with the federal hold. Garrett is a bully, Sandra said, and for the first time, something genuine came through the composed exterior. Not remorse, not confession, but something that had been held for a long time and had found in this specific moment the pressure release of being said. He's been a bully for as long as I've known him. A bully who thought the badge made him a king. I managed his money for 12 years. I built the structure that kept him from drowning in his own stupidity. I hid his tracks. I structured the deposits so they didn't flag. I set up the offshore accounts. I listened to him brag every Tuesday night when he came home about how he ran things, about how untouchable he was. Her voice had gone flat and precise, the voice of someone finally finishing an accounting they've been running in their head for years. I earned that money. 12 years of listening to a man who was too arrogant to understand that every single dollar he brought home existed because I was smart enough to make it invisible. I earned it. It's evidence, Marcus said. And you just confessed to wire fraud and money laundering. She looked at him, not with hatred, not even with anger quite, with something that was perhaps the closest thing to honesty she had offered in the entire interaction. You knew before you got here, she said. I knew before I left the diner, he agreed. Then why? She stopped herself. She understood. Because she needed to say it. Because the confession needed to be voluntary and on record, and in her own words, for the subsequent prosecution to be airtight. And because Marcus Webb was among his many professional attributes, extremely good at creating the conditions in which people said what he needed them to say without being coerced into saying it. The sirens reached the airfield perimeter. Blue lights strobed across the hangar doors. Sandra Pruitt looked at the approaching police vehicles. She looked at the jet behind her, with its idle turbines and its open cabin door, and the Belize charter itinerary that would never be executed. She looked at Marcus Webb, who was standing in the wet November air, without a jacket, with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world because the outcome is already settled. She held out her wrists. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not a surrender in the cinematic sense. It was the gesture of someone who has run a calculation to its conclusion and recognized without drama or self-pity that the math has stopped working. Marcus produced his handcuffs. He secured her wrists with the same procedural care he applied to everything, and he read her rights, in the same level voice he used for everything. And the words fell into the cold air around them, with the weight of words that are not performative but simply true. You'll want to retain counsel quickly, he said. The wire fraud and money laundering charges carry significant exposure. But the flight to avoid prosecution and the consciousness of guilt it establishes will be a factor in the sentencing calculation. How much? She asked. Her voice was steady. That's for the court to determine, Marcus said. But the range for the combined charges, given the aggravating factor of the flight attempt and the amount involved, is significant. A local police officer arrived at his shoulder, and Marcus transferred custody with the procedural efficiency of a handoff in an operation briefing the officer on the charges and the circumstances in 30 seconds of compact professional summary before turning back toward his vehicle. The charter jet's cabin door had been closed by airport security. The Gulfstream sat on the apron under the airfield lights, going nowhere. The pilot was being interviewed by an airport security supervisor. The Belize itinerary was being photographed by a federal forensics technician who had arrived in the second vehicle. Marcus got into his sedan and sat for a moment in the quiet. United States Penitentiary Hazleton sits in the hills of West Virginia like something the landscape would prefer to have not been asked to accommodate. It is concrete and steel, and the particular silence of an institution that is never actually quiet. The silence that exists in the space between the noise in the intervals between the slamming of cell block doors and the intercom announcements, and the shouted conversations that carry down tiers and through walls and become part of the ambient frequency of the place. Something that inmates stop consciously hearing after a while, but that never actually stops. Inmate number 7. 4309-039, formerly Officer Dale Pruitt of the Oak Ridge Police Department, had been incarcerated at USP Hazleton for 8 months. He was 38 years old, which meant he would be 70 when he was eligible for parole consideration, if the parole eligibility conditions held, if the federal guidelines didn't change, if everything went exactly right. He had spent time in the first weeks doing the arithmetic of that in different ways, approaching the numbers from different angles. The way you approach a diagnosis, you don't want to accept checking the calculation for errors that might change the result. The calculation was always the same. 70, if everything went right. He had learned quickly, in the way that people learn quickly in environments where slowness of learning has immediate physical consequences, that his identity as a former police officer was not a circumstance he could conceal, and not a circumstance that inspired sympathy. USP Hazleton housed a population that was by the nature of federal sentencing guidelines substantially composed of people who had at various points in their lives encountered law enforcement in its most adversarial form. Many of them had encountered Dale Pruitt's specific species of policing, not Pruitt himself, but the institutional pattern he represented, and they had long memories and strong feelings about it. He kept his head down. He moved efficiently between his cell, the cafeteria, and the work assignment he had been given. Mopping the cafeteria floor, a job that paid 12 cents an hour, and required him to be in the cafeteria before and after meals, which were the 2 periods when his presence was most visible and most commented upon. He had paid through arrangements he preferred not to examine too closely for a level of protection that kept the commentary from escalating into something physical. But the arrangements required resources he was steadily running out of. He was mopping the far corner of the cafeteria on a Tuesday evening in early spring. He had noticed with a bitter irony, he never spoke aloud, that the worst things in his life seemed to happen on Tuesdays when a guard appeared in the doorway and told him he had mail. He went to his cell after the mopping shift ended and found the envelope on his bunk. Department of Justice letterhead. He turned it over in his hands for a moment. He had been through a sequence of envelopes in the last several months. Appeal update notifications, sentence modification, denials, correspondence from his former attorney about the civil litigation that Marcus Webb had filed alongside the criminal prosecution, and that had consumed the remaining equity in his home and the boat and every other recoverable asset. Each envelope had been its own small severance from something that had once existed. He tore this one open. It was not an appeal update. It was not a civil litigation notification. It was a Department of Justice transfer notification, which is the form that USP facilities use to inform current inmates of the arrival of incoming inmates who share a family connection as a matter of institutional safety protocol. He read it 3 times. Sandra Voss Pruitt, sentenced to 14 years. Federal money laundering and wire fraud. Consciousness of guilt aggravating factor applied. Assigned USP Hazleton Women's Camp. The women's camp at Hazleton was a separate facility. Its own housing units, its own programming, its own cafeteria, but it shared the outer perimeter of the complex. There were 2 fences and an exercise yard between the men's general population units and the women's camp, and through the upper windows of the men's east wing, and from the exercise yard on clear days, you could see the women's yard. Not clearly, not close enough to recognize faces with certainty, but close enough to see figures. Pruitt sat on his bunk for a long time after reading the notification. The fluorescent light overhead hummed. The sounds of the block moved around him, the distant television, the voices carrying down from the upper tier, the mechanical rhythm of the ventilation system. He had lived inside these sounds for 8 months. He had stopped consciously hearing them. But tonight, they were present to him, each one distinct the way things become distinct when you are paying attention to them rather than simply enduring them. He stood up eventually and walked to the window of his cell. His window faced east toward the perimeter fence. The evening was clear cold, the tail end of a West Virginia winter, and the lights of the women's camp were visible across the yard, a separate constellation of institutional fluorescence beyond the two fences and the strip of space between them. He pressed his hand against the glass. Sienna. Below in the women's exercise yard he could see it, or could see the part of it that his window angle permitted, which was a corner where a walking path ran along the inside of the fence. A figure in a gray jumpsuit was walking alone. Arms crossed over her chest, chin slightly down. The walk of someone doing the institutional version of what civilians do with evening walks, a movement that has no destination but carries its own purpose. He watched the figure. His hand was still against the glass, the cold of it pressing into his palm. She stopped. He couldn't have said with certainty that she heard something or sensed something, or simply reached the end of a thought and paused. But she stopped, and she turned not all the way around, but far enough, and she looked in the direction of the men's east wing, with the particular angle of someone who has been told a location and is orienting toward it. She did not wave. She did not call out, not that he could have heard her through the glass and the distance and the fence. She stood for perhaps 30 seconds, looking in the direction of his building, and he watched her looking, and he did not know with the certainty he would have wanted whether she could see him at his window or whether she was simply looking at the building as a geographic reference point. It didn't matter. She looked, and then she turned her back and she pulled her arms a little tighter across her chest against the cold, and she resumed her walk away from him, and he watched her go until she moved out of his window's angle and disappeared from view. He stood at the glass for a long time after she was gone. He thought about a gray Chevy Tahoe parked on a dark, rainy street. He thought about a flashlight beam and a credential wallet, and the 1 second he had spent looking at it before he put the flashlight back on a man's face. He thought about $600 in a sealed envelope handed out of a cruiser window on a Tuesday night, and about the boat it had eventually bought, and about the driveway where the boat had been taken away, and about Sandra's back as she walked out his front door with a canvas bag and a travel mug. He thought about 4 seconds, just 4 more seconds spent looking at what was actually in front of him, instead of at the story he had already decided was true. And none of it, not the federal trial, not the 32 years, not the 14 years in the women's camp, 100 yards away through 2 fences would have happened. The chain of consequences that had consumed his entire world had its first link in 4 seconds of deliberate blindness on a wet street in November. He sat down on his bunk. The fluorescent light kept humming. Lake St. Clair is not Lake Michigan or Lake Superior. It doesn't announce itself the way those bodies of water do, doesn't dominate its landscape with the presence of something oceanic. It is smaller and quieter, and sits between Michigan and Ontario with the self-contained modesty of a thing that doesn't need to be the biggest to be significant. On a clear evening in early spring, with the last of the winter light going gold across the water, and the city of Detroit visible to the southwest as a smudge of illuminated sky, it has the quality of a place where the noise of things stops, and what remains is just the water and the wind and the specific silence that exists at the edge of moving things. Marcus Webb stood at the shore with his collar turned up and his hands in his pockets, looking out at the water. The light was going the sky, moving through its spectrum, from gold to amber, to the particular blue that precedes dark, and he watched it without hurry. He had nowhere to be for the next 12 hours, which was a condition of life that occurred infrequently enough that he didn't take it for granted. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He removed it without looking, already knowing the number. He looked. Diane Knox. He answered. Knox. I'm texting you confirmation documents, Knox said, and her voice had the specific quality of someone wrapping up something that has gone the way it should go, which was a quality Marcus had learned to recognize in Knox over 6 years of working alongside her. Sandra Pruitt processed and transferred. All seized assets recovered and cataloged, the $4.2 million included. Holt's plea fully finalized, cooperation agreement active. The Oak Ridge City Council voted this afternoon to appoint an independent oversight committee to review all departmental contracts from the last 4 years. A pause. Case closed, Webb. Marcus looked at the water. You did good, Knox said. We did good, he said. Merritt helped. Okafor was exceptional. The forensics team on the accounts was the best I've worked with. I meant you specifically, Knox said. In the back of that cruiser. Not everyone maintains that level of professionalism under those specific circumstances. He didn't say anything to that for a moment. He thought about the red lines on his wrists faded now to nothing gone within 3 days of the arrest. He thought about the cold asphalt, the wet grass, the weight of Pruitt's boot on his mind, if not on his body. He thought about being 44 years old, 22 years of doing this work, and still being the man in the hoodie on the wrong street at the wrong time for the wrong reason. It wasn't professionalism, he said. It was the job. Those are the same thing, Knox said. He couldn't argue with that. They ended the call. He put the phone back in his pocket. He reached into his left jacket pocket and found the challenge coin, the one from his first field office assignment 22 years ago. A field office in a city he'd since left working cases he could no longer fully describe with people, some of whom were retired and some of whom were gone. The coin was worn at the edges, and its face was the smooth of a thing that has been handled so many times. The original impression has softened slightly, become warmer, closer to the temperature of the hand that holds it. He flipped it once, caught it without looking, and closed his fist around it for a moment before dropping it back into his pocket. He was not done. There were other towns with other versions of Dale Pruitt running similar arrangements. There were other Councilman Holtz and other Brody Sykeses and other protective architectures built around the assumption that authority without accountability could sustain itself indefinitely. He had a case briefing in Flint on Thursday. He had a forensic accounting review in Grand Rapids the following Monday. He had sitting in a secure folder on his federal tablet 3 preliminary reports from 3 different jurisdictions about 3 different patterns of conduct that shared enough structural DNA with what had happened in Oak Ridge to merit a serious look. The water moved. The light went another degree toward dark. He turned up his collar, pulled his hands back into his pockets, and walked back toward the city. 8 months after his sentencing, Dale Pruitt stood at the window of his cell at USP Hazleton with his hand pressed against the glass and watched Sandra walk away from him across the prison yard. And it was in that moment, not during the verdict, not during the sentencing, not during any of the procedural milestones that had marked the formal progression of his destruction, that he understood with a completeness that no legal proceeding had managed to deliver the full scope of what 4 seconds of deliberate blindness had cost him. Marcus Webb stood on the shore of Lake St. Clair as the spring light left the water, and he felt in the particular way that people who do difficult work feel at the end of it, not triumph, but the clean exhaustion of something finished, something hard, something necessary, something that had mattered. He did not need it to be more than that. It was enough. Somewhere in the filing system of the Eastern District of Michigan's federal court, 17 counts of guilty existed in the permanent record. The money was recovered. The network was dismantled. In the Oak Ridge City Council chambers, an independent oversight committee was already reviewing the contracts, already finding what it would find. Cal Merritt was learning something new in Ann Arbor. Tessa Hale was working on the next story. The lake was cold, and the city was lit, and there was more work ahead, and Marcus Webb turned up his collar and walked back toward it, and the darkness closed behind him like water. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of justice accountability and the people who refuse to look away.